She flew across the world expecting a kiss, and instead got a step back. Cameras rolling, airport buzzing, and Ziad looked at Emma like she was asking for too much by leaning in. This was not awkward timing. This was the moment everything cracked. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Emma thought the first few minutes would feel safe, familiar, warm. Months of late-night calls, future talk, soft promises. All of it was supposed to land right there at arrivals. Instead, her body leaned forward and his body moved away. Not angry, not dramatic, controlled, careful, cold. That small movement said more than anything he had typed before. You could see it on her face. Confusion first. Then embarrassment. Then the slow panic of someone realizing the rules changed after the game already started. What made it sting more was not the boundary. Boundaries exist. The sting came from timing. Because this was never presented as new. They talked about meeting. They talked about affection. They talked about comfort. Emma did not invent this in her head. She followed the script she was given. And now, standing there, she was being told the script never existed. Ziad did not raise his voice. He did not insult her. That is why the moment hit harder. He framed it as respect, religion, culture, public behavior, all valid concepts. But they arrived late, too late. Emma was already there, bags unpacked, heart open, camera on. When expectations collapse in public, the shame feels louder than the words. She tried to laugh it off at first. You do that when your brain needs time to catch up with disappointment. But every step after that airport made it worse. Walking side by side with someone who promised closeness but now managed distance like a professional. Each time she reached, he corrected. Each time she questioned, he reframed. And slowly, the power shifted without anyone announcing it. And if you think this was only about a kiss, stay with this moment, because what followed exposed a pattern far bigger than one couple. By the time they reached the street, Emma stopped walking. Not for drama, because her body could not keep pretending nothing happened. She asked the question people ask when they feel played, but still hope they are wrong. Why did you not tell me this before? And that question hung there, unanswered in any way that felt honest. Because once reality shows up, words either stand strong or collapse on impact. And this was only the beginning of watching them collapse. Before she ever booked the flight, before luggage and visas and long airport lines, there is a version of this relationship that felt easy, safe, predictable. It lived entirely inside a screen. That version is the one Emma trusted. That version is the one that convinced her this leap made sense. It started the way these stories always do. Casual messages that turned into longer conversations. Curiosity that slowly became routine. Ziad knew how to show up with words. He asked about her day. He remembered details. He spoke about the future without hesitation, without needing to be pushed there. When someone talks about when you're here instead of if you come, it rewires your expectations. It creates a quiet contract. Emma didn't fall in love with an illusion. She fell in love with consistency. Distance made everything smoother. There were no awkward pauses, no moments where body language could contradict intention. If something felt off, it could be softened with emojis, voice notes, reassurance sent right before sleep. Online, certainty is easy. You can curate confidence. You can pause before answering. You can avoid confrontation simply by delaying it. And Ziad was very good at that rhythm. Emma, on the other hand, led with emotion. She spoke openly about wanting closeness, affection, partnership. She didn't hide that she needed reassurance. But the script never punished her for that need. In fact, it rewarded her. Ziad met her there with promises that sounded mature and grounded. He spoke about building a life, about commitment, about how serious this was. Not someday in a vague sense. Soon. Real. planned. That is how emotional trust is built, not in grand declarations, but in repeated confirmation that the future is shared. There were signs, but they were subtle. The kind people only recognize in hindsight. When Emma joked about physical affection, Ziad would laugh it off instead of engaging deeply. When she talked about public closeness, he'd shift the topic. But because nothing was happening yet, those moments didn't feel urgent. They felt like details to sort out later. Later became a placeholder for everything uncomfortable. What Emma didn't realize was that later was not a timeline. It was a buffer. The more real the plan became, the more abstract Ziad's language got. He still spoke about love, but specifics faded. Dates turned flexible. Expectations softened. Yet he never pulled away completely. That's what kept Emma anchored. If someone fully retreats, you protect yourself. If they stay just close enough, you keep hoping. By the time the flight was booked, the emotional investment was already locked in. Emma had rearranged her life mentally. She had explained this relationship to friends, to family, to herself. Once you do that, backing out feels like failure. Not just of the relationship, but of your own judgment. So when doubts crept in, she minimized them. She trusted the version of him she knew best, the one on her phone. Ziad wasn't lying in the traditional sense. He didn't invent feelings, but he operated in a space where words didn't yet require follow-through. Online, you can mean something emotionally without being ready for its consequences. And that distinction matters more than people want to admit. Distance doesn't reveal compatibility. It protects uncertainty. When Emma imagined their reunion, she didn't picture perfection. She pictured warmth, familiarity, the comfort of finally aligning what she felt with what she could touch. That's why the airport moment hit so hard. It wasn't rejection out of nowhere. It was contradiction. The kind that makes you question your memory, your intuition, your worth. After that first shock, Emma did what most people do when they want to save something they've invested in. She adjusted. She told herself culture mattered, that patience mattered, that first days are always awkward. She reminded herself that relationships require compromise. But compromise only works when both people are moving toward the same place. Every conversation after arrival carried an imbalance. Emma asked direct questions. Ziad answered around them. When she sought clarity, he offered context. Culture, expectations, family. None of those things were new concepts, but they were suddenly immovable. Before, they were flexible. Now, they were boundaries. And boundaries aren't the problem. Boundaries that appear after commitment are. Emma started noticing how often she was the one recalibrating. She adjusted her body language, her expectations, her tone. She learned to wait for cues that never came. Each correction chipped away at the version of the relationship she believed she was stepping into. But she stayed, because leaving would mean admitting the promises didn't survive contact with reality. Ziad, meanwhile, appeared calm, grounded, reasonable. That's what made it harder for Emma to argue her own pain. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive. He was controlled. And control can feel like maturity, even when it's actually avoidance. When one person is always explaining and the other is always adjusting, the balance has already shifted. What Emma wanted was not excessive. She didn't ask for public displays meant to shock anyone. She asked for reassurance through action. A hand. A step closer. Something that matched the intimacy of the conversations that brought her there. Instead, she was met with reminders of what she should understand. Understanding became the expectation placed entirely on her. This is where emotional labor becomes invisible. Emma carried the weight of making sense of the situation. She translated his discomfort into patience, his hesitation into respect, his distance into cultural sensitivity. Meanwhile, her own discomfort was framed as impatience, as misunderstanding, as pressure. And slowly, the question stopped being, "Why didn't you tell me this before?" and became, "Why am I asking for so much?" That shift is dangerous, because once someone starts doubting the validity of their needs, they stop advocating for them. Emma didn't stop feeling hurt. She stopped expressing it fully. She softened her language. She waited longer between questions. She tried to prove she was adaptable. And the moment someone starts proving they are easy to live without, they lose leverage in the relationship. What makes this story resonate is not the setting or the culture. It's the emotional math. The realization that certainty spoken from a distance doesn't always survive the demands of real life. Ziad didn't suddenly change. He revealed the version of himself that requires less risk. And Emma didn't suddenly become needy. She stayed consistent. The environment changed, and consistency exposed incompatibility. By the time days passed, the airport moment stopped feeling isolated. It felt like a preview. The first signal that the relationship existed comfortably only when nothing was required of him physically, socially, or publicly. Love was safe as long as it stayed private, flexible, controlled. Emma didn't come looking for conflict. She came looking for alignment. And alignment is impossible when one person is still negotiating whether the future they promised is one they're willing to stand inside. This is the quiet danger of long-distance promises. They feel real enough to build dreams on, but abstract enough to abandon when reality arrives. And this realization doesn't explode all at once. It settles in slowly, in moments of silence, in the space between expectation and response, in the growing awareness that you crossed an ocean for someone who never crossed an internal line for you. By the end of this phase, Emma wasn't angry yet. She was unsettled. And that unsettled feeling is often the first sign that love, as it was imagined, no longer exists in the same form for both people. By the time the days settled into a routine, the discomfort stopped feeling like jet lag and started feeling like reality. The excitement Emma expected to grow with proximity did the opposite. It thinned out. Conversations felt shorter. Touch felt regulated. Affection felt conditional. And the hardest part was that nothing was overtly wrong. There were no fights big enough to justify the heaviness she carried. Just a constant sense of being slightly out of place in a relationship that once felt certain. Emma began paying attention to patterns instead of moments. She noticed how Ziad was warm in private conversations, but guarded the second anyone else entered the room. How reassurance came quickly when she looked upset, but disappeared when she seemed calm again. How plans were always framed around what made sense for him, his family, his environment. None of this was malicious. But it was directional. Everything moved in one direction, and she was the one doing the moving. She tried to talk about it the way people do when they don't want to accuse. Carefully, softly. She framed her feelings as confusion, not disappointment. She asked for clarity without demanding change. Ziad listened. He nodded. He explained. And somehow, every explanation ended in the same place. This is how things are. This is what you need to understand. Understanding became the currency she kept paying with. What made it harder was the internal conflict Emma felt. Part of her didn't want to be unfair. She didn't want to be the outsider who refused to respect another way of life. She didn't want to be seen as someone who couldn't adapt. So she overcorrected. She swallowed reactions. She told herself love was bigger than discomfort. That compromise meant sacrifice. But sacrifice without reciprocity turns into erosion. You can respect someone's world and still realize there is no room for you in it. As Emma's confidence quietly thinned, the dynamic became clearer. Ziad held certainty now, not about the future, but about the present. He knew where the lines were. He knew what he would and wouldn't do. Emma was the one standing in the in-between, trying to negotiate space that wasn't being offered. The relationship stopped feeling like two people building something together and started feeling like one person asking permission to belong. That realization didn't hit her all at once. It arrived in pieces. In how she hesitated before speaking, in how she checked her tone, in how she rehearsed conversations in her head before having them. When someone starts preparing for every interaction, it's usually because they've learned their feelings are inconvenient. And then there was the silence. Not the absence of words, but the absence of effort. Ziad didn't initiate difficult conversations. He responded to them. He didn't push for resolution. He allowed time to pass. Time became his ally. The longer things stayed unresolved, the more normal they felt. Emma felt the weight of that silence more than any argument. Because silence forces you to fill in the gaps yourself. And when you're already insecure, the story you tell yourself is rarely generous. This is where emotional imbalance becomes self-doubt. She started questioning whether she had misunderstood everything from the beginning, whether she had read too much into messages, whether she had romanticized moments that were never meant to carry weight. The relationship didn't just challenge her expectations, it challenged her memory. And that's when the emotional cost became undeniable. Emma wasn't just disappointed. She was shrinking. The parts of her that felt confident, expressive, sure of what she deserved, began to go quiet. She adapted so well that she almost disappeared inside the adaptation. Meanwhile, Ziad remained steady, calm, unbothered. From the outside, he looked like the grounded one, the reasonable one. And that contrast made Emma feel even more unbalanced. When one person looks composed and the other looks emotional, people assume the emotion is the problem. But emotion is often just information arriving too late. As the relationship stalled, something else became clear. Ziad hadn't invited Emma into a future. He had invited her into a pause. A space where nothing had to be decided yet. Where he could enjoy connection without committing to consequence. And Emma had mistaken that pause for progress. There is a difference between taking things slow and never moving forward. Eventually, Emma reached a point where patience stopped feeling noble and started feeling self-betraying. She didn't want to pressure him. But she also couldn't keep pretending this was what she agreed to. So she asked the question again. Not gently this time, not vaguely. She asked what this relationship actually was now that they were face to face. The answer wasn't cruel. It was careful. Ziad spoke about timing, about responsibility, about how things needed to unfold naturally. But natural had become a word that meant indefinite. And indefinite is unbearable when you've uprooted your life. Emma realized then that no dramatic ending was coming. No explosive truth. Just a slow recognition that the version of love she arrived for did not exist in this setting. And that realization hurt more than rejection would have. Because rejection is clear. This was fog. Sometimes love doesn't end with a fight. It ends with clarity arriving too late to save it. Around the same time, the parallel story began unfolding elsewhere, mirroring Emma's experience in a way that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Jenny had already crossed her ocean years ago. She had already given up her home, her independence, her sense of self, and still, she stood in a house where her presence felt temporary. Living under Sumit's parents' roof turned daily life into a test. Not of love, but of endurance. Every movement was observed. Every choice was judged. Jenny learned quickly that silence was safer than expression. That obedience earned less conflict than honesty. And like Emma, she told herself this was what patience looked like. But patience without agency becomes submission. Jenny wasn't waiting for affection. She was waiting for permission to exist comfortably. And Sumit, like Ziad, existed in the role of mediator rather than partner. He translated expectations. He softened conflicts. He delayed decisions. He promised things would improve with time. Time again became the placeholder. What connected these stories wasn't geography or culture. It was the emotional structure. Two women, investing fully in a future that remained hypothetical. Two men, benefiting from delay, while bearing minimal emotional cost. And in both cases, love functioned best when it required the least disruption. When someone asks you to wait indefinitely, they're asking you to put your life on hold for their comfort. As Emma processed her situation, she couldn't ignore the exhaustion creeping in. Not physical exhaustion, emotional fatigue. The kind that comes from constantly adjusting your expectations downward. From celebrating small gestures because you've learned not to expect big ones. From telling yourself this is fine because admitting otherwise feels too heavy. She began imagining her life after this, not in anger, in quiet. She pictured returning home and explaining what happened. She pictured the disappointment she'd feel not just in him, but in herself for staying longer than she should have. And that anticipation scared her more than being alone. Because staying meant continuing to erode. Leaving meant confronting loss. Growth often begins the moment staying becomes more painful than leaving. The relationship didn't explode. It faded. Each conversation confirmed what she already felt. Ziad wasn't going to meet her where she was. And she couldn't keep lowering herself to reach where he stood. That gap wasn't cultural. It was emotional readiness. Emma finally understood something important. Love spoken without accountability is not a promise. It's an option. And she had treated it like a guarantee. As clarity settled in, the power dynamic shifted again. Not because Ziad changed, but because Emma did. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped justifying her feelings. She saw the situation for what it was, not what it had been sold as. And that clarity, while painful, was grounding. Jenny, too, began seeing the cost of waiting. The years lost, the compromises stacked, the dignity slowly traded for stability. When Sumit finally chose her publicly, the victory felt hollow. Because choosing late still carries a price. The damage done during hesitation doesn't disappear when commitment finally arrives. Delayed commitment doesn't erase the harm of the delay. Both women reach the same realization from different timelines. Love that asks you to disappear is not love that can sustain you. And no amount of patience can transform someone into a partner they are not ready to be. In the end, there were no villains standing over ruins. Just people facing the consequences of promises made without preparation. Emma didn't leave angry. She left informed. And that information changed how she would love moving forward. Because once you understand the difference between words that feel good and actions that feel safe, you stop confusing the two. And that lesson, painful as it is, stays with you long after the relationship ends. By the end, nothing felt dramatic anymore. That was the strangest part. No slammed doors. No shouting. No single sentence that destroyed everything. Just a quiet awareness settling into Emma's chest. Heavy, but steady. The relationship didn't fall apart. It revealed itself. And once seen clearly, it couldn't be unseen. She looked back at the beginning and noticed something she had ignored before. How certainty always came easily when distance protected it. How love sounded bold when it lived in messages and promises. How the future felt safe when it stayed abstract. And how quickly that certainty thinned once reality asked for consistency. What hurt wasn't rejection. It was revision. The feeling that the story she had believed in was being slowly rewritten without her consent. Not because anyone lied outright, but because important parts were never fully told. She had filled in the gaps with hope. He had allowed that filling in to continue. The absence of honesty hurts more than honesty ever could. Emma understood now that clarity delayed is still clarity denied. And denial always costs the person who is waiting. She had spent months adjusting herself to fit inside uncertainty, calling it patience, calling it love. But patience had started to feel like self-erasure. When she finally stopped trying to fix the discomfort, something else happened. The fear softened. The constant internal debate quieted. She no longer needed to prove her feelings were valid. They were valid because they existed. And that realization grounded her in a way reassurance never had. She didn't leave feeling victorious. She left feeling intact. The audience saw it too. Not in a single moment, but across her posture, her tone, the way she spoke with less apology. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about opting out of a dynamic that required her to stay small. Peace often arrives when you stop asking to be chosen. Jenny's story reached its own version of that truth. Years invested. Roots planted in unstable soil. Love that asked for endurance more than joy. Even when commitment finally arrived, it arrived after so much waiting that it felt heavier than it should have. She got the future she was promised, but only after paying a price no one should have to pay for love. Watching both stories side by side made the pattern impossible to ignore. These were not stories about geography, or faith, or family rules. They were stories about emotional timelines colliding. One person ready to live now, the other protecting a later that kept moving further away. Neither Ziad nor Sumit were portrayed as monsters, and that is what made the stories uncomfortable. Because harm does not always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from hesitation, from wanting comfort without responsibility, from enjoying devotion without offering certainty. Good intentions do not cancel the impact of prolonged indecision. The show never had to say this out loud. It trusted the audience to feel it. Every long pause, every delayed answer, every moment where a woman asked for clarity and received reassurance instead. Reassurance is soothing. Clarity is stabilizing. These relationships offered the first and withheld the second. That distinction mattered. For viewers, the discomfort hit close to home. Many recognized versions of themselves in these moments, waiting for someone to be ready, believing time would solve what honesty could have addressed early, calling endurance love because letting go felt scarier.